And then I did 1-year exchange program at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo.
Did you guys have Chris Yip while you were there?
I don't know if I ever had him, but I know who he is. I might have had a history course, but I wasn't the best student. So I actually...
So you tried to avoid Chris?
I'm pretty sure I had him, but I didn't come to class. Not because of him. I think I was not very...
We won't go there.
I was one of those kids who just dedicated everything to studio and like nothing else in my life mattered, which is like not the way to operate.
I hate those kind of students.
Yeah, and now I spend my time trying to convince people not to do that.
Yes, right, and to catch up yourself.
Yeah. I'm like, I know you think this is the good way to operate, but trust me, it's not in the long term. Health-wise also.
No, that's true.
So you founded and also direct cityLAB, is that correct?
That's right.
And could you explain cityLAB, what that is for people who might not be familiar?
Sure. And I don't want to take whole credit because I did co-found it with Roger Sherman, who abandoned me about 5 years ago. So I both give him credit and blame him for whatever happens next.
Not bitter at all.
Not that I hold him personally responsible. So we actually were, I guess, really troubled by Hurricane Katrina in 2005, 2006, when architects had no response to the crises. Actually, new urbanists went down to the Gulf. It was like one new urbanist per mile of coastline. Mm-hmm. And it was really not adequate. And what they did was a pastiche architectural solution for what was really a humane crisis, a environmental crisis, and an urban and architectural crisis. So Roger and I thought, well, finally let's get an architecture research and design entity started that would take the city seriously and the architecture of the city seriously. So we started in 2006 at UCLA. I had kind of discovered an office because I had a master key that no one spent much time in, and we just squatted in there for a while, yes, until somebody said, what are you doing in here? We changed the names on the doors, put the other faculty who never came onto another door, and, it was really seat of the pants. Yeah. And now it's, very established. So it was a good way of starting, and the department and the school were actually very generous about giving us the infrastructure we need to operate. But at the beginning, we didn't really even know what it was.
I feel like that's pretty common for a lot of designers or architects to use an architectural solution to solve more complicated issues. I mean, I don't know. Am I wrong? It happens quite often, and certainly architecture can be a generator, an icon to certain things. But I feel like sometimes we confuse those two, and we kind of conflate issues, and we think that with a piece of architecture, we're going to address urban issues, ecological issues, and yada, yada, yada. And it's a tough, I don't know. Do you see this?
Well, I completely agree with the first part of what you said. Everything for me starts with space. I can't write a book without, the right desk environment, cup of coffee, whatever it is. You need to make the setting right. Yeah. And for cityLAB, since we really didn't know quite what it was going to become, we needed to make a site where we could galvanize whatever we could draw together, whatever we could scrape together to make kind of these innovative experiments about the city. So having the right space was critical. But I think maybe the part where we didn't make the same fallacy that we often make in architecture is we didn't think that was enough. So then we started really trying to amass resources, which we didn't really have financial resources at the time. We had our labor, and we had a lot of really dedicated, brilliant students and colleagues, and we had friends in the city. And so we kept trying to organize things like competitions, conversations, books, basically. We wrote a book pretty early on out of the colleagues and the network of, brain resources we had at hand, and it grew from that.
So how large is it now?
Well, that's a little hard to say. It's kind of like an architecture firm. We now have 3 of us full time, which is really great. It's really hard to get. I hire 2 people full time now in the university, one of whom's an academic appointment and one of whom's a kind of research director appointment.
Gotcha.
And then we probably have 12 students
Wow.
working. Yeah, it's big.
That's pretty big.
Yeah, they don't work full time for us during the summer. A lot of them do, but we have a bigger net than that because we teach through something called the Urban Humanities Initiative, 24 students for an entire year, every year. That's Mellon Foundation funding that's really allowed us to do interesting experiments with the curriculum that blends architecture, planning, and the humanities together to think through
And is that
cities.
within the architecture and urban design program?
We have a
Or
piece
is
of
it
it.
kind of, okay.
It's actually located in architecture and urban design, but it's really a pan-university program.
Gotcha. Actually, is Melissa Peter some of this involved?
Yes, and she's one of our cityLAB folks.
Yeah, she went to Cal Poly, so I know her
Right.
from that time.
Right, she's a
Right.
gem.
Yeah, she's great. That just occurred to me. I remember seeing that online recently. I'm like, oh, that's a connection. But since Hurricane Katrina, you guys have probably tackled
13 years.
The difficult thing with a big natural disaster like that, I feel like, is that it hits the media. It's everywhere for about. It feels
nanosecond.
like a week, and then I feel like now it's getting less and less to like hours almost, and then everyone kind of forgets about it.
Yeah.
But so presumably since then you've been working on other things other than.
Well, it kind of set the mission of architecture, urbanism, and social justice in motion for us. So we've always had that nexus as our guide. And, there's never a shortage of social justice problems that are spatial or urban. And if the crises of something like a natural disaster, which appears to happen over a 12-hour period, but in fact is still going on in some place like New Orleans, for the first few years, we focused really globally, mostly nationally, but also globally. We did a project in South America, and we did projects, in various parts of the United States. We won a competition in Arizona, and did work that we basically organized around 5 initiatives. So we, if the world of problems comes to us as architects, how do you sort through them? And we decided we would focus on rethinking green, which was kind of our sustainability mission, the post-suburban city, which really, Los Angeles is the mother of suburbanism, so we were right in the heart of that. Spatial justice, what's something we called urban sensing, which comes out of my work in pervasive computing and various kinds of digital spatial computing. And the last one was new infrastructures, which actually came out of Obama's national program. So those 5 things, every project that we look for, we don't respond to problems, we generate our own approach to problems that we think we can actually address. So I got really fixated on the post-suburban city, being a affordable housing person. Roger worked a lot on new infrastructures while he was still with cityLAB, and each of those then also had sustainability issues built into them. So we continued to sort of seek the right sites where an architecture of the city could really address social issues, social and cultural and political issues. Not everything rises to that level. You had to look for kind of the low-hanging fruit where you could find a success. So that's sort of the mantra,
The post-suburban city, that's an interesting question to tackle. And I was actually curious if, it's sort of related to that issue, but there are certain kind of city typologies. There's the kind of gridded city, there's the garden city, and a number of other ones that you probably know of. Do you see? Is there anything in your vision that would be classified as like the next typology that hasn't happened yet, or do you think the post-suburban city might be that thing?
Well, I think, like you're saying, there's types of cities. Certainly the Manhattan model isn't the one we're grappling with in the Southwest, as you probably know from having lived on both coasts.
Yep.
So really we've been focused on that city that took its greatest formal leap in the post-war period. Albert Pope the urban designer that's at Rice, called that the city of space rather than the city of form. And I think that's a really good description of what I've been most interested in, the city that just expands horizontally and doesn't really have, it has a network of mobility connections, but it doesn't really have a formal organization.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're dealing with that now, especially now, I feel like cityLAB is just primed. You know, it's like we took the leap off the high dive and we're in the pike position, ready to make the perfect 10 dive. Because the housing crisis is so extreme that even Californian politicians, Los Angeles council members, people that never got onto this bandwagon before, are fixated on solving the housing crisis,
Right.
and not finding solutions. And to me, that's what architecture does best, is lays out a vision of what might be the next kind of incremental change in the city or transformation of the city that other people can't imagine, and then we can aim towards it.
Right.
So I'm an anti-utopian and an anti-incrementalist, actually. So those are the things that are usually posed against each other.
Yeah. And so you fall somewhere in the middle, kind of?
Yeah, I think of something that I would call a radical increment, meaning that when you do something small, it generates or catalyzes a much larger effect. And I think we have a lot of that conversation going on in architecture now, so it's not such a novel concept.
Do you think that the formless nature of Los Angeles is a problem for it, though? Because I've often wondered, when living in Manhattan, like what makes Manhattan so successful, if we could say that. And there's many non-formal and non-architectural reasons, but I've always kind of assumed it had something to do with the very clear organization, minus the striking Broadway, which screws everything up, but it also was necessary, and the fact that it's an island and it's contained. So I've always felt there's a very clear mental image to people living there, and that's where Los Angeles, I feel like, is much more fuzzy in the mind. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, that's basically what Kevin Lynch said in 1960, right, is that Los Angeles was unimageable.
Right.
Yeah, I'm an Angelino for sure. I mean, I wasn't born here, but I love Los Angeles and the Southwest. I think for an architect, there's no better place to be working. You know, I don't know what people do in New York besides like tinker with interiors. This is going to offend maybe my New York colleagues. But here, we really have a canvas that's amazing and needs us. So, like, where would you rather be than, like, the Southwest? I'm not sure if I could handle Phoenix. They probably, you could say that my characterization would apply to them also. They need us desperately. But it doesn't have an architectural history like Los Angeles does. I mean, the European immigrants, the, Spanish colonial heritage, the long traditions of architectural manifestations here make it so that we can make changes here that are really both architectural and urban.
I think that's true. And that's partly why we were drawn to coming out here for those reasons. I guess so. When you're saying that you're kind of let me get this right, what was it? A radical?
Incrementalist.
Incrementalist, right? So that would sound like maybe that's a more bottom-up approach to thinking to things, whereas maybe a more utopianist, if that's a word, would say, like, I'm providing the top-down, the big vision, and that's maybe necessary to, I don't know, to generate excitement about it, or just to have, again, that much bigger image of the city. Do you feel like that's necessary for Los Angeles, though? Well,
you're right that Los Angeles doesn't have at least a single urban construct, right? I mean, it's what Bob Stonewall and lots of others people have called an urban architecture without urbanism, whereas someplace like Barcelona or maybe New York has urbanism without architecture, particularly Barcelona in my mind, where you really know the grid of, Cerdà's Eixample, but you don't really think of any individual building within it. Here in Los Angeles, look at Grand Avenue, the sort of attempt to make an alternative downtown. It's just a string of buildings. It's hardly even held together by a street.
Right.
So, what does it mean to have urbanism here? Some people would say that that's exactly the kind of place you need a grand master plan,
Right.
which I sort of think of as the same as a utopian model.
Really?
And, to me, those have never worked. They might serve as narratives, right? They work perfectly in science fiction or in a book like, Utopia, right? But for actual implementation, no one ever even implements a master plan. It kind of sets an abstract ideal and you aim in that direction.
Right.
But I'm more interested, and I think this is where architecture and architects play a role, in building something as a demonstration that shows what you should do next or what might happen next. So that's what I would call a radical increment, is a kind of architectural intervention that has a DNA that can spread. So
Right.
to me, the backyard homes work that we did for the last 10 years is just that, a radical increment. It's an architectural project, but it's vastly urban in its implications.
And the accessory dwelling unit is what you're talking
That's
about, right?
right.
Could you
Yeah.
maybe describe that for people? Because I just recently occurred to me, we have a lot of listeners that are not even in the country.
Oh, yes.
So they might not know. We always go in these really deep conversations about things, and it just occurred to me, maybe they don't know what it is, and you'd be the perfect person to describe an ADU.
It's funny because I was in New York giving a lecture on ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and they were like, where do you do those things?
Yeah.
If you don't have backyards, you do them on rooftops, I guess. So because of the suburban context that exists, it's not just in Los Angeles, but all over the Southwest. You see it all over Europe, also outside major cities, where single-family dwellings sit on single pieces of property. And it's the pavilion and the garden model. Andrew Jackson Downing started it here. We then spread it like a virus, I would say, to many other parts of the world. Though some people would say actually the Romans were doing it too, so we shouldn't take credit. But Los Angeles really gave birth to the expansive sprawl of the single-family dwelling, which is really a plague environmentally. The greenhouse gas emissions alone. So what we started working on in cityLAB was an idea of doubling the density. 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I started saying, what cityLAB's goal is to double the density of Los Angeles. And people's hair caught on fire thinking about that. They would say, you're trying to Manhattanize Los Angeles.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
It's a very powerful and visual word to use, Manhattanize. But people like to use words like that.
Yeah, yeah, we should find our equivalent. The post-suburban city doesn't have quite the same power.
It's a little bit long.
Yeah. So basically, what we started doing was trying to figure out how you take this free land. Basically, you have land in people's backyards. There's no one home to mow it anymore, right? Mother's work, father's work. There's, this average size of a household is like 1.7 people. So what is all that space around?
Is that my phone? Oh, you know what? I set an
You
alarm
have
for
an alarm?
before we were going to start to make sure that finger.
Time to begin. Yes. So we started studying every aspect of the suburbs in Los Angeles, and very quickly learned that there were already a huge number of secondary units in people's backyards. If you look across the working class, blue collar, low income neighborhoods, there are garage apartments and DIY, do it yourself secondary units everywhere. So we studied that for a while and realized that some neighborhoods, as many as 2/3 of the properties of single-family houses already had.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Which means it's
There's
a good solution.
There is a need, yeah.
Definite need, so much so that people would do it without permits and legally, so that because you can't then sell it.
Yeah.
You don't get to build wealth in your property that way, but you keep your cash flow working in ways, and your family. So then we went out and went to Pacoima in particular, where there was a really generous group called Pacoima Beautiful, who introduced us to all of their members. And the older women, property owners that came to meet with us would say, we own our homes, we borrowed out of them to send our kids to college, now our kids can't come back, and they don't want to live in a condo, and they don't want to live in some old traditional thing. We want to attract them to come back, but we want to build new kinds of spaces for them. they would live in our backyards, but not in the house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it started to just become a logic. Like everybody basically had a backyard home story. If you had a backyard, you wished you had a way to settle some caregiver, nanny, adult child returning, yourself, so that you could live in a smaller space and rent out your house and get better income.
How were you guys doing this research?
Well, just like anthropologists might, right? So the students that were working at cityLAB, we generally have used paid research assistants at cityLAB and occasionally taught it through class. But I have a real principle that if we're doing research, we pay students to do it. We don't go with that architectural intern thing. Yeah, it's really an important principle. It's kind of hard to live up to sometimes because we're always pulling together money, but we pay everyone who works with us. Occasionally we get a project that's so research-oriented, we do it in a classroom. But so we would go out to Pacoima. Sometimes we were speaking in Spanish and in English and trying to show people, like in a focus group, alternatives, what would they like? That then would generate solutions for us. Then it would set up the next set of questions. Like people all said to us, oh yeah, well there's a standard lot in Los Angeles and it's 50 feet by 150 feet. If you ask somebody, what's the general lot size? That's the number they'll tell you. There's no such thing. It's not even the median. There is no standard lot in Los Angeles. And when you look to see how to build in people's backyards, you realize since everybody's done all kinds of stuff, there's it's like a thumbprint. Everyone's different. So, somebody's added a little back patio. Another person's added like an extra room in the backyard. So the shapes of the sites that were left, even if the sites were somewhat consistent, were really inconsistent. So that started us on architectural projects, right? So that's what cityLAB's always trying to do, is look for the projects or problems that architecture is best at solving, where architecture is the lever that opens up solutions. If it was just backyards, a planner could rewrite the zoning and be done. And in fact, that's exactly what had happened in Los Angeles. There had been a secondary unit, accessory dwelling unit law on the books. I think it was in 2003. And between 2003 and 2011, 200 units had been built. So something was wrong.
Yeah.
And it's because nobody had ever studied what it meant to actually try to build something under that law. And once you did that, there were these crazy laws that made it impossible to add a structure in, I'd say, 90% of the backyards, something called the passageway law. Don't even ask me. I mean, it was made on a 19th century fire truck and how you'd get passage to a backyard to put out a fire.
Right.
So
super necessary.
Yes. So then you'd say to the city council, so our first attempt, it was such an education for me because, the logics of it were so obvious. You'd say, oh, well, look, if we just removed the passageway law, all these lots could actually take advantage of an existing law. Let's just modify the law. Yeah. Not a single council member. We brought it before the council multiple times, and there was always one loud neighbor who had somebody building a backyard home next to them that they didn't like, or something like that. Yeah. And so somebody, I don't know, they don't have jobs or purposes. They should volunteer at the hospital, if you ask me. But instead what they do is spend their time down at the city council and protest things that would really help 80% of the population, but isn't something that they like, which kind of discourages you in general about what we consider participatory processes.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So the couple things. The first is that I think, so the research you guys did was raw, real, on foot. You're going there in person to do it. It wasn't like some kind of Google Wikipedia research, which I know it wouldn't be, but
we use that too.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that's really interesting, and I think that it sounds like it's a lot of fun and it's super necessary. It's also a way for you guys to be more flexible and malleable, to go where you have a hunch and to make things happen quicker, I suppose, and also for it to be real. So I think that's really amazing. But I've always wondered how difficult was it to get some of these ADU laws through and working with the city councils and going to these kinds of meetings? Because I think one of the tough things as being a person that's interested in urban design is that you might have a passion for it, you have a passion for city planning and even neighborhood planning or small scale and people and et cetera, but how often do I get a chance to actually do any of this? Because that requires what you guys have done, which from an outsider seems like, well, that's just a massive undertaking. So how difficult was that process going through and making it happen? Because it's not common.
It was a massive undertaking. I don't want to discourage people like you, like so many of our students who really feel mission driven to make a difference in the city or in the environment, right? So, I think the days are gone when we as architects can just throw up our hands and say, oh yeah, well, homelessness, that's too complicated for us. I mean, we have to deal with these things, but just how you go about it. cityLAB is one model. There are probably many others. You will start your own practice to do something similar. I think a lot of firms do it as a kind of pro bono effort that goes on for years. But at cityLAB, we use the university as our home, which has, strengths and problems. Like it's really hard to build something, for instance, at the university because of all the liability laws. And we really want to do demonstration work, and we have built a couple little things, but that's really a hurdle.
Like actual construction of stuff.
Yeah. Like students aren't supposed to get up on ladders.
Right.
How ridiculous is that? So,
really?
Yeah.
It happens anyway in studio.
Yeah. Right. The things they don't know. Well, so that's kind of why cityLAB has, I've never tried to grow cityLAB too large because being slightly under the radar is a big advantage for us. But going back to your question, how hard was it? It required, a huge collaborative alliance of dedicated students and city people, and no matter how many times we tried it at the city level, I had one partner that I should really mention, a woman named Jane Blumenfeld, who is a policy wonk, total. So she really loves being in the weeds of that kind of language you can barely understand. So the first principle of doing this kind of work as an architect is find the right partners. Right. People you really like who appreciate the fun of it, who really are like visionaries, but also great partners to work with, who do something better than you do that needs to be done. So Jane was the policy wonk woman. Then I think there's a kind of stick-to-itiveness that's really hard to do when you have a project by project by project orientation, which is the way we think about architecture. So a standard architecture practice is, you're working away at your desk and you try to get another project. And when that comes in, you try to finish the last one, then you try to get that one done, you hope to get a new one. And it's this it's like serial monogamy. You get a new best friend working to work with all the time, but keeping continuity between those, what I would call the long game. Like, how do you play a long game in architecture, which all of us wants to do? So, if Richard Meyer does that by, cutting an opening in a plane in every different way possible on every project he has, that's a kind of long game. I totally respect that. It's not the one I'm interested in, but that's one that he's really, along with other game, which we all oppose. But many architects have a formal long-term project. How do you maintain a political or social mission? That's the really important question, I think, that our profession hasn't really answered. And so cityLAB is a model alternative, which takes advantage of a kind of nonprofit status of the university and its ability to bring a wide range of people together, and has an amazing teaching goal as well, to breed the next generation of people who want to do that kind of work. Right. And I expect that the students that work with us will be generating other new models. It's another kind of radical increment, actually. It's a kind of practice-based radical increment cityLAB.
So when you're saying that it feels like maybe architecture hasn't quite figured out a solution to have a long game or a larger thesis or series of problems they're working on that are more on the political or social side of things rather than the formal, perhaps, is that a current thing that you've seen the last, 20 years or so? Or is that, like, what makes you feel that way?
Well, modernism, I think, had a deep political and ideological agenda, as did the futurists. I mean, we might not agree with some of the historic political movements within architecture, but modernism is the elephant in the room whenever you're talking about that. So, from Siam, I don't know, how should we explain this to a more general listener? Basically, at the turn of the century, when machines and machine logics and new mobilities and new technological possibilities all came together, architects took advantage of that situation to develop a way in which they thought architecture could change society and change the city. And that produced modern architecture in all of its forms, great and horrible. And what stuck, I think, in the public imagination is the horrible, because as it was sort of stripped down by less talented and more prodigious builders, it wasn't really embodying the very principles.
Right.
That would be one critique. Many people would say, it never had a humane dimension. And I think there's some truth to that also. But the circumstances at the turn of the century, whether it was technological and economic and political, zeitgeist, global zeitgeist of the developed Western world, came together to make that movement. Okay, so it's no longer with us, though we've probably thrown the baby out with the bathwater with that. And I see that we're in a similar moment now where between the environmental crisis and the housing crisis, which is global and not just, north of the equator, Western white problem with those people leading it, but really universal situation, we could, in fact, as architects, play an important role, not alone, but an important role in trying to reshape the next era that we all depend on doing a better job.
Do you think,
Does that
though...
sound like a zealot or a missionary? Yeah.
Do you think, though, that how much of that mission has to come with very strong formal solutions? And do those formal solutions need to stay consistent throughout the lifetime of something? Because I feel like that's, again, what people can latch onto. And so in the case of modernism, people latch onto the aesthetics, we could say, and yet that's why you have bad architects reproducing stuff that looks similar but doesn't have embodied the spirit. Does this kind of, the split between the principles and the form is something that I'm always thinking about. Is that something that you see as being one of the challenges with all this?
It's hard for me to understand why we let that split persist. Someone needs to write the philosophical text on why we can't think of aesthetics and social good in one mind. It's like the vase-face illusion.
Yeah.
They
The
have to be
chess piece
together, but they seem separate. That seems false. That's a really false dichotomy to me. And it's one that I'm always arguing against. Of course we have to have aesthetics. Why wouldn't you want the beautiful world to dignify people at every spectrum of life and on every city? That should be the goal. I don't see why that's, I don't know. This is what is often a problem with my planner friends, is they think of the aesthetics as a kind of pastiche you put on afterwards, or something that isn't really necessary. It's just like eye candy. And to me, it's actually really fundamental. I think you can't be embedded in an architecture world without understanding how fundamental that is and why that's important in people's lives. Most people understand why going to a symphony is inspiring, kind of fills your soul with a sense of grandeur. Why isn't that part of the way we feel when we move through the city? I think that is kind of what people feel who are urbanists when you go through Manhattan. I mean, of course, some people are like totally turned off, but people feel the power of the city there, and maybe the power of what Rem Koolhaas called the culture of congestion. Like our whole civility feels like it's with you in the middle of a high-rise landscape. That's a good thing.
Yeah. So do you teach urban design?
Well, if by that you mean, do I teach studios with urban? Actually, I'm not even sure I use the term urban design anymore. So I don't teach studio any longer. I used to teach studio.
Okay.
Now I teach seminars and kind of project-based work. And then I have this kind of practice research entity called cityLAB. But usually urban design seems to come with the utopian-like master planning models.
Yeah.
So I feel like we need, I talk about urban architecture or an architectural urbanism, because I always really think about the architectural increment as the starting point. Even though everything I do is tied into systems and networks and infrastructures, I think from an architect, especially when you're teaching in an architecture program, you really start with the building, and then that has to be thought of as something that works out, that's kind of rhizomatic or viral, or it has a DNA.
And I think that's an interesting approach to architecture itself anyway, and it's something that not every studio does for sure. I think there are plenty of studios that focus just on the form of the building, which is an exercise that has to be done at some point. But the urban context that would inform a building, and if it gets duplicated especially, or its rules get duplicated, is, it's a really fascinating one to me, at least, and I don't know. I think it's fascinating, but it seems to be a lot of times in architecture studios, not urban studios or whatever, architecture studios, we don't really ask those questions.
Yeah,
those are kind of pushed to the side. I think maybe it's a fear of projects becoming too pragmatic or too much in a response to things and not enough their own. You know what I mean?
I'm done with architectural autonomy. Enough already. We've actually, I think the discipline goes through phases, and for a long time we really strengthened the discipline. That was when theory was really the major counterforce to practice, and Peter Eisenman and Tony Vidler battled it out a woolly mammoth against a saber-toothed tiger.
Which one was which?
Yeah, I don't know. I like them both, but still, that's 40 years ago. We don't need to do that anymore. The discipline, maybe we'll go back to that in another 20 years.
Sure.
But right now, what we need to do is situate the discipline in the global landscape, in the landscape of the city. There's so much work to be done. It's immoral that at least a piece of what our profession isn't dealing with that.
Yeah. And is your background
is that strong enough?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean everybody has to do it. There's still people that have to teach technology, that have to know about long spans, that have to figure out what seismic requirements there are. And, I'm all for the people who are developing beautiful buildings. I think Frank Gehry demonstrated with Bilbao that has a real power. But there needs to be a kind of expertise grown in thinking through the cultural politics of architecture.
Thinking and sharing it, I think, too, because it seems like the typical architect has a client, and the client might not be receptive to the architectural and formal interest, or they might not understand the big principle behind it, right? So that's where I think the architect needs to be able to kind of explain that to the client and make them understand.
Yeah. Some people say and I have been known to say this, that we should smuggle in the public aspect of architecture in every project we get. And, I think maybe there's some truth to that. Even if you have to me, there's a kind of myth that what happens to us as architects is that we sit at our desks and projects come, right? It never really works that way. I don't know any architect who ever just waited and it got raining projects, right?
If there's someone listening who that happened to, let us know.
Yes, right. We'd all like to know how that happened.
Yeah.
Mostly it's a matter of, the silver spoon model, which was the Philip Johnson model. Like, he was born with a Rolodex in his diaper. So,
He came out of the womb with a Rolodex.
Yeah, exactly. So he knew who to contact. People came to him. He sat at the right table at the Four Seasons. He worked the world to make himself the powerful center of a particular kind of architecture in New York. And that's a project, Mm-hmm. So what's our project? If you set forth, there are a lot of really interesting young firms now, public architecture firms that are working as nonprofits, that are really trying to set up their table outside the Four Seasons and generating a group of clients that are really receptive to doing that and want that kind of work. So how those architects eat is another question, right? How do you support yourself when you're doing good and working with underserved populations, for example? That's tough. That's why a lot of people in teaching are the ones who have the opportunity to do that.
Right.
It shouldn't be the only way, but there should be a means by which, if you work in a big firm, so-called moonlighting, and I think a lot of large firms have this, there's a kind of pro bono dimension which they support in different ways. I think firms should give young architects sabbaticals. After 6 years, you could get a year to, at half pay, to do work that you've been really motivated to do, whether that was a technological development or a social project, something that isn't really part of the economy, the standard economy of practice, and then bring that back to the firm. There were some firms where research was an important component for a while, in the aughts, but I don't know what's happened to that now.
Which offices?
Places like Kieran Timberlake, they had a deep research agenda. Often it was related to their practice, which is totally fine. They were looking at materials and assemblies and things like that, but they gave people time to do research. OMA and AMO is the classic, right? That they started a research wing.
Yeah. I'd love to get sabbatical if I was working for an office and still get healthcare and all those things and go off and do some research. I think it's an interesting point. I was trying to think of other models that I know, but I don't really know of that many. I've seen a couple different offices. They have essentially two different businesses, in terms of legally they're separate. And so one was not architecture and the other was research, but it was one is architecture and the other is architectural, but not a project-based thing. And that one seemed to generate the most money. It felt. I don't know. I'm guessing. It certainly seemed that way. And I've always wondered if this other thing that they created was secretly feeding money to the architecture side of stuff to fund them to do more interesting works. Like competitions would take up a huge amount of resource and time, and et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of split model, it seems to exist, and it's one way of doing it. I'm not sure if there's another to have it be less split. Maybe there is. I don't know.
When at a time like now, when global warming and the housing crisis are in everybody's front page, local news, evening news, over breakfast, it seems to me firms recognize the intersection between work and the conditions of the world. So, most architects now would love to get into affordable housing, even though there's not much money to be made as an architect in an affordable housing project because they're so complicated. Still, there's so much work that needs to be done. People see that as a growing market. I'm all for when market and issue intersect. Some people would take a much more radical stance than me and say, really, it's because of speculation in real estate that we have an affordable housing crisis in the first place, and unless we opt out of real estate being an engine of wealth, we're never going to get. I think that's true theoretically, but I don't know how to act on that.
Yeah, I don't know how we get there.
Right, right. Sometimes I think we should just move to Sweden, which I did for a while.
You did?
Yes, that's a beautiful place where you would have a sabbatical after whatever job you have. Yeah, as long as you can find somebody else to train to take your place. It's an amazing, like they talk about the end of the welfare state, but from our perspective, it's alive and well.
So how long were you in Sweden for?
Well, over a 10-year period, off and on, I taught in 3 different universities, and my kids went to school there for part of the time. Yeah, so it was
Really?
I
know nothing about
I really
Sweden.
spent just a 6-month period at a time, kind of there. But
They don't speak English there, do they?
yes, they speak English so beautifully that
They have
I
a great accent,
never.
too.
Yes, I never learned enough Swedish to say much more than "you're a fat man." Things that children taught me.
Okay. I was like,
It's very
who are you
bad.
saying this to?
Yes, no one who would have actually deserved the criticism, fortunately.
So where are you from originally?
Where am I from?
Yeah.
Well, I grew up, strangely, on an orange grove near the Mexican border here in California. My
Okay.
grandfather came when he was 12. He was Irish, and he was kept inside the house until his accent was gone, and
Really?
he always said he was English because that meant you would be less discriminated against. But he planted an orange grove and sent my father to college on 10 acres in Southern California. And then my father took a job as an engineer. He went to college, and we had 25 acres. And then I have 2 sisters. So the 3 of us and our husbands all worked and put every penny we had into the orange grove and couldn't keep it alive. The cost of water and the economy of the agriculture changed in just those 3 generations. But I think I grew up seeing landscapes change so radically that that's what got me interested in architecture. Like when the first sidewalk came, it was so thrilling that I thought there was nothing better than building in suburbs and
Right.
really perverse origins. But
When did the Orange Grove, I guess, die or finish?
well, we only sold it maybe 5 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, we sold it to people. It's in San Diego County in a little town called Valley Center. We sold it to people who commute into San Diego for jobs. So it's now a lifestyle. I guess it went from a business through a struggle to becoming a lifestyle.
It's a pretty amazing thing
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
move to the United States and have your son, your grandfather have your dad, your son, go to college like straight away, and then grow
Right.
this orange grove,
Right.
especially for that time. Like that's
Right.
a pretty amazing thing to have that happen so quickly. And then
It's
like you're
amazing.
Danikov, so like
It's amazing that in 3 generations it went really from one world to another. Yeah.
And you stayed in California primarily.
Well, now it turns out that way. I left, to go to college. I worked my way north in the University of California system. Then I went and taught at Rice and at Colorado and, outside of the state. But eventually came back. Prodigal daughter.
Your education was at Berkeley, correct? In architecture or in?
Yeah, actually, I've realized 5 universities of California. So I'm really a California kid. I went to Santa Barbara to start, and then to Santa Cruz, where I was an art major, and I made up my own major in design, where I really started thinking about architecture. And I also was a psychology major there. Yeah. So when I went to graduate school, it was kind of like, okay, I'm really interested in people and how they think, and I'm really interested in art and design. What
Bingo.
would that do? So I thought graphic design. I applied in graphic design. I applied in architecture, and I got into Berkeley for architecture, and I thought, okay, let's try that. It was really random, kind of.
Wow.
Yeah, but turned out to be like the best choice you could have possibly made, because Berkeley was really open at the time. And, I studied in linguistics and cognitive psychology, and also in architecture, took a kind of master's degree program in architecture, though I went directly into the PhD program there. They made us, if we didn't have architecture backgrounds, take studio, which was brilliant, really.
Really?
Yeah. I wasn't the best studio student.
In what way?
My professors were often putting little trees in front of my facades, for instance. Yeah, doesn't mean that I don't really appreciate good design, but I wouldn't say that was my forte.
Okay. That's an interesting thing, though, that you have to take studio.
Yeah, it was good.
I know the program that I did, they didn't accept anyone. I mean, it was technically it's an urban planning degree, but everyone calls it urban design. You couldn't get in unless you had done a 5-year in architecture or had a degree in landscape architecture.
Yeah.
But you had to have studio under your belt in order to come in.
I actually think that's great. And, there aren't many programs now that require someone, say, doing an advanced degree to go back and do studio. I think even at Berkeley, they've stopped that part of it. But for me, because I'd been in studio art, I was kind of accustomed to the making world. And that's really why I got into architecture, because I wanted to be making things as well as thinking things. And that really is what generated cityLAB also. But teaching studio was also really great for me because you see how architecture works. And unless you understand how architecture actually plays out and think of that critically, it's like if you don't understand how digital platforms work, you can't actually manipulate them in creative ways. It's a tool. So unless you understand the system that you're operating in, that's my feeling, you can't turn creative corners with it. Yeah. And so, having an urban planning background or an urban design background, you begin to understand how urban policy works. If you don't understand that, it doesn't take school training. It can be practical training too. But if you don't understand how that works, you don't know how to shift policy.
Sure.
In the case of the ADU bill, which I'm so proud of, 8.1 million single-family properties in California now can have a second unit.
Wow.
It's actually shifted the man's home as his castle into something we share. I feel like it's a metaphysical change. And of course, it produces it could produce more housing than any other single mechanism. It was a group of women behind the scenes of 2 state legislators that were personal connections that came together to make this. So there were 2 of us in Los Angeles, and there was a group of 3 women in Northern California that I knew from my old Berkeley connections. And we were doing this work simultaneously without knowing of each other. Right. And by chance, I figured out that one of my friends was doing something similar. And they were doing a perfect bill for Northern California, and we were doing a perfect bill for Southern California, but their built landscape is as different from ours as Manhattan's is.
Yeah.
So they were working on secondary units that you could carve out of a big house. Yeah. That's not exactly, I think that's an interesting model now, but it wasn't when we passed that bill, the thing that was really dominating Southern California's thoughts. It was really backyards. Yeah. They were much less likely to have a flat backyard. So we were writing different bills, and if those had gone forward, one would have worked and one would have failed. And so we married the 2 bills. We built everything of theirs into ours, and they built everything of ours into theirs. And then we had lawyers working like crazy to, figure out how it worked. But it was a single bill that we put forward that they'd done as much research really on secondary units in Northern California as we had done in Southern California. So, that was an amazing continuing education about how policy works. And now I'm dedicated to, using that knowledge to make new policy changes for housing.
Those are rare insights to have, it's like you got to make use of them.
Yeah. Yes.
You put all this work also.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's true. It would be to put it to waste, not to, but right now what we're working on, for instance, is something we're calling schoolyard housing. So we did backyard housing, and now we're doing schoolyard housing. And it's another place where I think architecture really is needed to figure out how to do it. So from K through 12 to community colleges to universities, there's all sorts of sites that aren't used, whether it's above existing classroom buildings or fields that aren't being used or surface parking lots. That's a primary one. At the community colleges, there's acres and acres. There's 1,100 community colleges in California, and 11 of them have housing for students. And they have something like somewhere between 10 and 30% of their students are homeless. So there's a state bill to make it required that community colleges allow students to sleep in their cars overnight on campus.
Are you kidding?
That's a good solution.
Right. No, but it's better than that they clear them out, police them out.
Yeah.
So, it's really apparent how desperate this is. And in the kind of, maybe this doesn't sound politically correct, but in the low-hanging fruit model of affordable housing, students are a great population because everyone would like to be able to help students, and especially students who are going to community college who are already working so hard so that they can do better in school. So that seems like a perfect place to demonstrate that schools can become sites for new forms of affordable housing. And some of the ways to do that aren't obvious because schools haven't been housing, services people,
right?
Except for at the universities and maybe boarding schools or someplace like that. So we're trying to figure out how to use this excess capacity land in schools and then change the policy in the state of California to make it so that schools, because if schools could build housing, you could build new facility for schools in the housing, like so computer labs or music rooms or whatever communities nearby need, like a community room or computer labs could be used by the neighbors. The schools could get the operating income, even if low, if it's affordable housing, that would help them with their budgets. And there'd be a population of residents that get supported and have a nearby school. So it's like win-win-win. Those kind of models that Silicon Valley is always talking about. But actually seems like it might work in this case. This is one of those kinds of things, I think, like the ADU, that seems obvious when you talk about it, but it's going to take a while for us to make that happen. So we've been doing a series of demonstrations and studies and the same story, basically. I'm hoping it doesn't take us 10 years like it did with ADUs, but maybe 5.
I mean, if they cut it in half, that'd be pretty good.
It would be.
Do you find, because when you're describing these things, the rationale behind the ADUs and the rationale behind the student housing, it's very clear. Right, it's very understandable. This problem we have that exists that maybe you weren't aware of, but it exists, and here's a solution to it. Right? Do you find that the people that you have to approach, I don't know, city council members or the community, whoever, do they get it, or is there's a lot of struggle convincing people because I don't know, of whatever variety of reasons?
I think individually they do get it, but the constituencies maybe not so much. So, for instance, if you say to an elementary school that's got 4 acres of surface parking, look, let's put housing above this. You're not going to lose a single playing field, and we'll add parking for the housing. You won't lose a thing. They'll say, we don't want affordable housing in our neighborhood. We don't want construction at our school site. We don't want people living in the schools. So they've never seen it before, and so it's really difficult to overcome those kind of mental blocks.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's one of the ways why architecture, doing demonstrations, whether it's in drawings or models, that interactive, like participatory processes, all of that's good. But I'll tell you, we jumped the local and went to the state because we could never overcome some of the really rigid thinking of very loud individuals. Yes. And so that's not democratic, right?
Yeah.
It's just somebody who's got extra time and really loud. So my new principle is incentivize at the highest levels, like from states, and customize at the local level. So instead of giving people the authority at a local level to say, yes, we'll build housing at our school, the state says, if you build housing at your school, you will get extra funding for the community rooms, for instance, more subsidized lunches, I don't know, whatever it is that the state can use to incentivize. For instance, what we did with ADUs is we reduced the parking at the state level. So it made it so that people could build on more cases, more lots. So there was a way of incentivizing adding an extra unit. And then localities can make changes that fit their particular needs. So there's still some kind of local participation, but it's not control.
Right.
And that puts me at odds with a lot of the people who have the same kind of political affiliations that I do, which are, progressive or radical.
Because you're not, directly addressing or communicating with at that local scale enough?
Yeah.
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 I'm actually, at the moment, feeling like local control is local barrier, and that we can't remove participation at the local level, but we can't use that as the means to make change.
It's a really, really difficult thing because
It is.
I've been to city council meetings, and it is always the case that I've seen that it is individuals. It's not the whole
Right.
group. And if you have a whole group, then
Right.
clearly
Right.
something, you're probably not doing something right. But it's
Yes.
always the individuals, and those are the people who drive the conversation. It's what, and maybe it's just the way the human mind works, but everyone leaves that meeting just remembering that one person talking. And it's like, of course, they're the ones that say it loudly and repeatedly.
Yeah.
And soon it begins to distort everyone's understanding of what the whole community actually wants
Right.
to that person's favor.
Right. Well, we see it at the national level with people like the Koch brothers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people who have money. And at the local level, it's people who really have time as much as anything else, or a single issue that they really feel strongly about. And trying to figure out how to engage local. It's really an interesting problem. I mean, a lot of times now in the work that we see, like let's take community-oriented development around transit-oriented communities. There's a participation process that has to be undertaken, say in Los Angeles, where they hold community meetings. But some of those are just pro forma. There's no real reason why you have to listen. It's maybe the goodwill of Metro or of the facilitator in which that happens, but the processes are really uneven. It's good, but we don't really have systematic mechanisms to make sure that the people who aren't represented get their needs met. And that's really been the constituency, particularly in affordable housing, that they don't form an interest group because they don't have any place to be. They don't have an address.
Yeah.
Right? So now, with the activism of tenants' rights groups, for instance, there's really a constituency that matters. I mean, if all the constituencies are represented, it's a mess, but it's worthy. Right? Then we say, okay, fine, let's just get into it, and it might take more time, but really we're going to hear what we need to hear.
Right.
But when whole constituencies that are really the least well-served aren't represented, then I think we have to find another
not fair,
strategy.
yeah.
It's totally unfair.
Yeah.
Well, that's where going out on your own to knock on doors and whatever
Yeah,
else is.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know how else you would get that information or begin the conversation, right?
Right.
It's really, really fascinating. It's also interesting to hear that your education up until Berkeley was very varied, and you're interested in kind of these different things, and and architecture very clearly to you now, and perhaps even then, was kind of at this intersection of these different questions. And then ultimately, the urban, I don't know what you call it, if not urban design, architectural urbanism, right, is even more at an intersection of all those other things.
That's exactly right, David.
Right.
Yeah.
At what point did you realize that that picture became really clear to you?
I'm not sure it's that clear to me now. Really, it's a lifetime of shaping through practices. I really think I'm a scholar, so I have to really respect the life of the mind. But I think we are what we do, and to a great extent. And so over the course of my career, what I've built has been through my actions, from writing books to starting cityLAB. Really, the first books I wrote was about architect-client negotiations, trying to figure out where design happened. So I went like an anthropologist into firms and watched how decisions were made. And I was stunned because it seemed like no one ever made a decision. I didn't know how buildings came about. It was really so interesting. It would be like landing in the Trobriand Islands or something, even though I'd been doing it. So that was super interesting to me. And I, talked about it really being a kind of negotiation that, course designers brought important creative expertise, but it was not possible to do in a vacuum. And so how does it work? So then thinking about that kind of negotiation and I spent a year in 3 different architecture firms watching them, really like in a zoo. Then I thought, well, this is actually what's going on at the city level also. Like, how does public housing get built in Los Angeles or Houston? I got really involved when I was living in Houston with a public housing tenants group of 1,000 units that were about to be demolished, and in an African-American neighborhood. It was really an education and really good friends that I made there. And I realized that was also a crazy negotiation. And like, how was that playing out, and who was at the table and who wasn't? So then my second book was really about the architecture of the city and how that got negotiated, particularly in Los Angeles around housing, because I was always interested in the spaces that matter most to us, which I thought of as home. I don't know if that's a gendered view or if that's really true, but maybe I would say now public spaces would be an equally interesting place to study. And then after doing that book, I realized I needed to get into the thick of it myself, so that I actually had to try doing it. Just watching it and studying it and seeing how other people had done it wasn't a full enough research investigation for me. So I wanted to see what it was like from the inside, and that's really what started cityLAB.
That's amazing. I mean, I think a lot of people, they, especially now, maybe they go to an undergraduate school with a certain major and they kind of decide, okay, I'm going to do this thing, and they have it in their minds that they're going to be confined to, or they're going to stay with and see through this particular career. But it seemed like in what you're describing is that approach, if you could call it that, or a way of doing things, was never really at the front of your mind or how you did things. It was more like, I have these questions, I'm just going to go where these questions lead me, even if it means like I have to deep dive into doing this research myself, which is a big leap to take.
When I hear you describe it like that, you have to acknowledge what privilege I had, really. I was lucky enough to be able to not have to leave college with a well-paying job. I could live off my shoestrings and take a crummy teaching job to start with and, kind of use it. I was able to use the privilege I had, which I'm pleased about, and probably I could have even done more at the time. But I recognize also that's a fortunate situation I was born into, in a way. And there are other people, I'd say, in architecture who don't have that same that spectrum of interests. They may. I definitely don't want my model to be, in that sense, I'm not a cult. I don't think this is the way everybody has to live. This is a model, and we need in architecture more models. So for the students who go through and really want to practice, I feel like that's a fantastic idea. Sometimes I think, when I watch my students, really talented, brilliant students who are really dedicated with larger principles as well as architectural goals, and they have to go work in big firms to get rid of student debt. Boy, I was really lucky not to have student debt. I was lucky because the University of California existed, and I could get a $6,000 fellowship and eat top ramen for 4 years and get a degree. That's really amazing. That's not available to people who don't live in California the state schools are equally public gift that we should be supporting at all steps. So how do you do it if you've got student loans? And I don't know, it's always been a nights and weekends kind of profession, and maybe that's where some of our best hopes go. But again, students that I have who have children, students who I have who are undocumented, I mean, they don't have that same kind of opportunity.
Right.
We should be expanding as much as we can in every way we can so that those people too can follow their dreams.
Yeah, I think it's a good strategy for the profession just across the board. And I think also it's maybe even more necessary than before because of student loans, that if you're going to go to become an architect, that's what I want to do, graduate in architecture, have my bachelor's, get my license, work at a big office, pay off my loans, depending on the school you go to, that's going to be a long, long time. And a lot of the people we've seen, they have that, they just assume that's what's going to happen for them. Maybe they'll get married and have kids. And then 7, 8 years in, they're like, you know what? This is totally not even close to working financially and in other ways. And they have to do a back out and then a U-turn or going down some other avenue.
That's interesting.
And I think if maybe the younger generations are more open to thinking about these different models or following questions, that maybe it would help solve that very specific problem. Because I think a lot of people do recognize that doing I was going to say 9 to 5, but it's more like 9 to 2 a.m. Job at an office is not going to, it at some point, it doesn't work out after a certain period of time, just because there's not enough money.
Yes. What were you going to say?
It's not sustainable. Yeah.
Right. It's definitely not sustainable. Well, so let's put in a plug for the Democratic presidential candidates that want to wipe out student debt. I really feel like we also have agendas that should extend beyond architecture to try to solve that problem so that there's a more equal playing field when students get done with school, that they can follow their dreams and dedicate themselves to their communities and their projects and their work, and have a family at the same time.
Right.
When we hold this model that architecture, a lot of the best of it happens between 9 p.m. and 9 a.m.,
Sure.
not, 9 to 5. Of course, really jobs you're committed to have sporadic needs for extended commitments, but it shouldn't be the thing we uphold as our Howard Roark image of self, right?
Yeah.
Because it just excludes too many people, and it's not sustainable, as you say. So, I really admire the generation that's in school now, and maybe just the group before them, who believe they have to have a life. I mean, for people like me who went through school with the idea oh my God, if you're not spending nights and weekends at it, you must not care.
Yeah.
I see now students really care, and they know they can have a life. And I, admire that. I learned from that.
Yeah, good for them.
Good for them. Yeah.
I missed that boat.
Yes, well, you're in the generation that should have caught it. Yeah.
I was actually going to ask you, I mean, it's kind of a funny question, but in your kind of journey going from these different studies into architecture and where you are now, did it ever cross your mind to enter the world of politics yourself? Because
you were talking, I was like, she should just be running things. What are we doing?
I mean, I think there's the expertise and knowledge, and there's natural persona and charisma, which I think you have, and awesome, cool glasses. As a glasses wearer, this is the first thing you notice is good glasses. But in my own thinking, that's kind of how my own evolution so far in a way has happened, is going from graphic design, you mentioned, was actually industrial design for me, and then architecture, and then kind of urban thinking.
That's interesting.
And I have no plans to enter the world of politics or be a politician or do anything like that. But it just occurred to me that in that kind of expanse, that I wonder at what point does a person begin to think, well, if I'm going to have a huge impact, I've got to go over to this the other side or cross this line.
Yeah. Well, I am in architecture first and foremost, so that's my medium. And whenever architecture can become political, that's where I work. I don't want to leave architecture to become a politician. I really admire the people that do. The guy who was head of HUD, I can't think of his name right now. We've had one head of HUD who was an architect, not the current guy. But, I'm really glad some people do that. To me, to be at the intersection with politics and, really running cityLAB and this big program, the Urban Humanities Institute, I feel like I'm leading a kind of ethical campaign as it is. In the university, there are a group of faculty and students who are really dedicated to social justice and spatial justice and social change. And I'm really proud to be a part of that group and to make sure architecture is always involved in that. Yeah. Because too often we're isolated and working late at night as if, just our hard work is really what matters, rather than that the kind of changes we can make in the world are also things that matter.
You were talking about, I think there was 5 different types of projects. I don't know if you would call them that at cityLAB. And one of them you had mentioned, is something about technology?
Right, urban sensing.
Urban sensing, yeah. What is that exactly?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of what's evolved into smart cities. And I have a different feeling about it now than I did when we started. So at the very beginning, I was working on something called pervasive computing with a group of faculty at UCLA who were really doing sensing networks. And I became part of the computer science faculty. I've always had a really deep interest in technology as well. And we were trying to create cities that could be, in fact, politically, we wrote a lot of articles about this, like that you could do political shopping. This was maybe 10 years ago, that you would see a jacket and you could then scan whether or not it had animal rights, child labor, where your money went, how much profit they were making, right? You could have a kind of
actually
smart...
know what you're buying.
That's right. And that information is there. You could get it right off of a UPC. And so we were trying to imagine what it would be like if you could actually enable your politics spatially in the environment. And so that might also be like monitoring, sensing when your biomechanics are being monitored. So if you go to a stadium now, there's biorecognition systems that are operating, and we're not aware of them. How do we make people aware of the surveillance state that's operating? There were lots of questions at the time that seemed like a bubble of like smart city stuff. Could we, in Sweden, for instance, classic, they had mechanisms that they were putting in cars that would slow the car down to the speed limit that was posted. So the roadways and GPS allowed them to monitor speed. And the Swedes that were in the test liked it. I can't imagine an American thinking that their car should be controlled. Yeah, right. But, those kind of things, you could make a safer street, you could make energy from the way the cars traveled. All that seemed really promising to me at the time. And cityLAB got involved with interactive facades. So we built one on Hollywood Boulevard with David Erdman, who's now dean or director at Pratt, where students shaped beautiful facades that had information as you leaned into looking at the facade of this particular store. It told you which clubs were operating, which one had long lines, where you could go to hear music that night nearby. It could tell you all kinds of things, and maybe that was kind of playful, but it was a great test of like making communication between people and buildings.
Right.
I still think there's some interest in that, and we've gotten into autonomous vehicles a little bit, similar kind of project, but that hasn't kind of risen to the top. Maybe if I had different students or different colleagues. The woman that we work with a lot now at UCLA, Marta Novak, who's part of a firm called Anonymous, she does a lot of work on smart technology, like desks and chairs that are responsive and how you make a better office space.
It seems like the smart city or smart architecture or smart whatever,
right.
It seems like this looming idea that everyone feels or thinks it's going to happen very soon. Like we're on the cusp of it. But it seems to be getting maybe delayed, and maybe that's, I don't know, but this is my kind of reading of things.
It's happening. Now you can travel flying in the sky on a little hoverboard.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
So we're finally getting there.
Yes. But one of the things that seems true to me, even from the first with the smart city stuff and the pervasive computing, is that I thought it would have real impacts on the form of the city, that architects would end up being involved. Turned out it was kind of like, I don't know, like a thermostat. that doesn't change architecture. It's smart. It makes the world more comfortable. It's a good thing. But, like why do I care that my front door could be activated by my, recognizing me through my eye and not turning at a lock?
Right.
It just doesn't have very many formal implications. And so far, I think that's true with autonomous vehicles, too. And we'll see if Sidewalk Labs in Toronto isn't just a giant police state, which is what it kind of looks like. There's a way in which I think a recent article said, I'm all for dumb cities. The smart city thing has a lot of problems baked into it.
There is something. Well, with the autonomous vehicles, I think that's the first step. And if those become much more common, then I think there's going to have a ripple effect to other things in the city, like the sidewalks getting wider or whatever. But it does feel like a lot of the technology in terms of buildings and architecture and the shapes of things is it's very hidden, and it aims to be hidden, and it aims to not change anything really, but just make things slightly easier.
Yes, yeah. And so in the end, they're kind of formally trivial. They may be in other ways absolutely significant, but from what architects can do with it, it's trivial. I mean, that's what I think has happened so far with these kind of smart technologies. And if that's the case, to me, it's good somebody's working on it, but that's certainly not the space where cityLAB should be working, where what we're trying to do is really take experimental aspects of the city that have big architectural implications. So far, I can't tell. I mean, if it's wider sidewalks, that'd be great. Yeah. But, okay.
Yeah.
Like, let's have more cafes? I don't know. What does that mean?
In New York, maybe it was like 8 years ago now, they started implementing these, I don't know if you'd call them kiosks, but like they were maybe 2 feet wide by 10 inches deep and maybe 8 feet tall. And they were, I don't know, a glorified Swiss Army knife technological thing. You could plug in your phone to charge it, which no one ever does unless likely that person is homeless. I mean, that's the only, that kind of person is the only person stopping in the middle of 42nd Street to
and
plug
standing
in the phone.
there for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
What other functionality do they have?
I think there's like some kind of emergency button, and then but the big thing was a big screen, which displayed either helpful information or it seemed like 70% of the time advertisements for various things.
Right.
And actually,
they're solar powered or something, right?
Yeah, they're solar powered, I think. Actually, it's a good question what else they did. I'd never bothered to look into it more because I walked by like I have no use for this, right? But that seemed to be like one kind of toe into the future city.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a stretch even. But anyway, implementing these kinds of technologies into the city also comes I think is perceived by a lot of people as being very dangerous. Pervasive, right? Invasive, controlling. They're going to monitor you and things like this.
There's a part of that that's a rational fear, right?
It is a rational fear.
It is rational,
right?
I mean, the idea that Big Brother might be watching you has turned out to be the case too often, whether it's through social media companies or surveillance cameras. So I think. A lot of times when people are fearful of something that we suggest, it's for reasons that they have bases.
Right. I don't know what the smart city in the future is going to be or what it means. I think it feels like very often when there's an opportunity to build something new in the city, like this kiosk thing or new light poles or whatever, there's a tendency to just shove in the most obvious and convenient things like a USB port to plug in your phone.
Little minor UX and you're done.
Yeah, right.
Well, it's funny. I guess maybe this seems retrograde, but I think techno-utopia is less interesting than something like better bike lanes. To me, if we were going to do something radical to the city now and to do something radical about cars, it wouldn't be making them drive themselves. It would mean getting them off the road. So why don't we have dedicated streets, not just bike lanes, going one way? Like, move the cars off. In Santa Monica, in Culver City, in Burbank, all that roadway, how much of the time is it not used? Then there's certain times that it's absolutely congested, and people use that as the model for why we can't narrow the roads. And in the end, if you look at a place like Barcelona, where they've made everything one way and the traffic goes speeding past, like scarily fast, but they have wide sidewalks. We could redirect traffic. The traffic planners know how to do it, and get more bike lanes, and all of us would be on our bikes.
Yeah.
I mean, half the time now, you can't predict how long it's going to take you to get across town because of traffic. If you're on your bike, you know exactly how long. It might be longer, but you know exactly how long. And there are ways in which Los Angeles could become like the future by actually getting rid of cars. You know, my colleague, the parking man, has said that if you just get rid of parking, you end up getting rid of cars. And I'm all for that. You know, there's simple ways, and maybe this goes back to the Dome City model, but if we do more straightforward things that are seemingly not high tech,
Right.
you know, that may be better than any kind of autonomous vehicle, even though we love working with it. So, you know, I'm all for new tech inventions, but the idea that that's going to change the city, I don't think that's where the answer lies.
Is it tough, though, to sell some of those other things because they are not as glossy and appealing and new, like getting rid of parking or simply making bike lanes? Like, they're not as seductive.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
I think that's really right. So why don't we make bike lanes more seductive? Why is it just green paint?
Oh, it's so
Really?
sad.
Yes. I mean, and we're so glad to see it.
Yeah.
You know, an old curb gets put between a bike lane and the street, and we celebrate like it's a radical new moment.
Yeah.
When really, you know, if we had, I don't know if you've ever biked through real biking cities. I mean, either in some parts of Asia or in parts of Scandinavia. It's wild. I mean, you ride at certain miles per hour in Copenhagen and hit the traffic lights for the bikes at the right speed. And it's scary if you're not riding at that speed and you know how to make a left and a right turn, and all the, you know, like features are made for bicyclists, and you're part of a Koolhausian culture of congestion. It's exciting.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's really fun. And I think, you know, to shift the terms so that, you know, the storefronts are more oriented towards people going 10 miles an hour than 40 miles an hour, or stop and go, or walking. You know, there's just ways that city could change that would be more radical maybe than autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, yeah. We covered so many different things, and this was super fascinating. I'm trying to think
great questions.
if I had any other questions. I don't think. This was really, really great. So cityLAB, is there a website or whatever people can go to?
CityLAB.ucla.edu. You find everything we do there, and like a long record of all the publications. Everything we do is totally public, totally non-proprietary. Please use it. Borrow it. We show how to build ADUs, how the law got put into place, studies of how people are implementing it now. There's publications, projects, everything, and all the people that work with us.
How are you guys funded?
Okay, that's a big question.
Okay.
By the seat of our pants, with many, many different sources, project by project. I mean, the university gives us my salary and space, and that's really fantastic. So we have no infrastructure costs. But everything else we pull together through generosity of individuals and foundations. And the Mellon Foundation right now has funded our big project, but we have lots of bits and pieces for all kinds of other projects.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
This was really great. Again, thank you so much. And it's exciting to hear everything. And thanks for doing what you're doing. It's awesome.
Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure.
Thanks, guys, for listening to this week's episode. We super duper appreciate it. And thanks to our sponsors and supporters, Nod and Archicad, and of course, Dr. Dana Cuff. I think it was a really interesting conversation, a stimulating one, an honest one, and we'd love to have her back in the future. We hope you, the listener, enjoyed it. And if you like what we're doing, show us your support and love by leaving a review and sharing this podcast. That's really the best way to spread word, right?
Yeah, and actually there is many places where you can leave a review, correct?
No, there's not actually.
No? Oh.
That's what makes it difficult. Yeah.
So, then no, that makes it easier for them. They already have a few places to leave a
The
review.
Apple Podcast app is the place to leave reviews for us and comments on YouTube. We also have a new hotline. That's 213-222-6950. Again, that's 213-222-6950. 6950. And so call that. It goes straight to voicemail and leave a message. Tell us about what's going on in your life. It could be anything, design and architecture and urbanism related or not. And we'll play it out on the podcast and have a little chat about whatever it is that's going on in your life. And also, as a reminder, we have these tips and tactics episodes where we provide useful information about, for example, how to design a portfolio, create a resume, apply for a job, and these kinds of things. And they've been amazingly popular. And so we're trying to solicit questions for future ones. So we're going to do a recording about how to interview and how to pass the AREs, the architectural registration exams, to become a licensed architect in the United States. So any questions you have about those two topics, call that number now and send it in, because we're going to record those very soon. There's many
and
other things
also
to
if you
say.
have any other topics you would like us to do a tips and tactics about, let us know.
Okay. you ended as if that's a question. It's awkward. Okay. And we're on all the social medias. Find us on there. And thank you for listening again. It means a lot. We're going to keep this going. And we hope you guys have a good week. What about that? Positive note.
Yeah, good week. It was a long weekend, so it should be pretty good now.
It should be good. It doesn't.
Now the next holiday is November, right?
No,
so,
there's Halloween.
Halloween isn't a holiday. You don't get the Friday off or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, okay. So anyway, have a good week, and we'll talk to you again next week or sooner. Thanks. Bye.
Why do you make me
say
sound
goodbye?
like I'm...
Say goodbye.
Bye.
Oh my God, this is the worst outro
Why
ever.
do you make me sound like